Everything you're hearing is from the Home Depot. From the baseboards and nails to these throw pillows, even those super soft sheets. Because now at the Home Depot, you can get everything for your bedroom, from wooden nightstands to modern benches. Save up to 25% on select bedroom furniture, plus free and flexible delivery and easy in-store returns. Shop decor now at HomeDepot.com. More saving, more kinds of doing. Valid on select items online only. Free delivery on select items $45 or more. Visit HomeDepot.com for more information.
Welcome to Creating a Family. Talk about adoption and foster care. Today is the show you've all been waiting for, our annual show on the adoption tax credit. You're going to enjoy it as you always do. You're going to learn things as you always do. Here's a sample of what you're going to hear.
It's very important to see what your tax liability is. That's what I advise everyone. Look at your last year's tax return, and that will give you an idea of what your tax liability is each year, and that will kind of tell you how much you're going to be able to use of the adoption tax credit.
This show is brought to you by Creating a Family. We are the National Adoption and Foster Care Education and Support Nonprofit. I'm Dawn Davenport. I am the host as well as the Executive Director of Creating a Family. This show is brought to you by the support of Jockey Being Family Foundation. Their mission is to strengthen adoptive families through post-adoption services. And one of the things they do is provide or have their free backpack program for newly adopted children. So if you know of an agency that would like to provide free backpacks, they're adorable, high-quality backpacks, customized with the initials of the child, as well as inside an adorable little bear and a blanket, as well as some parenting resources. Have your agency go to their website, jockeybeingfamily.com, and click on the backpack program, and they can apply therein. And it's a great program, and I think you'll want to do that. In addition to Jockey Being Family, we also have partners who believe in our mission of providing unbiased, medically accurate, as well as emotionally accurate information about adoption and foster care. One such partner is Holt International. They were founded in 1956 with the goal of providing children with loving and secure homes. They have programs that strengthen and preserve families that are at risk of separation, and they lead the global community in finding families for children who need them. Today we're going to be talking about the adoption tax credit for 2018, and that is for taxes that will be filed in April of 2019. This is a topic that is relevant to anyone who adopts, or should be relevant to anyone who adopts. Our guests today are Becky Wilmoth. She is an enrolled agent and adoption tax credit specialist with Bill's Tax Service. And we have Josh Kroll. He is the Adoption Subsidy Resource Center Coordinator at the North American Council on Adoptable Children. Well, welcome to Creating a Family and this interview, Josh and Becky. I should actually say welcome back. You guys have been so kind to every year do this interview, and it's so well received, and it is so helpful. So let me start by just saying thank you. Let's start, Josh, with you, and I want to start at something that is extremely basic but extremely important. Well, first of all, let me just say what the amount is. The amount for the adoption tax credit for 2018 is $13,810. All right, and that's for qualified adoption expenses. Now, we're going to talk about all of that in just a minute, but I want to go back some and talk about the word credit. This is a tax credit. So can you walk us through, Josh, the distinctions between what a credit is, where it applies, and how it differs from things like deductions or other forms of tax savings that people can utilize to reduce their taxes?
I'm sure. And the one thing I do want to just clarify on your intro is that special needs adoptions that are considered special needs don't necessarily have to have qualified adoption expenses. Just want to make sure we don't lose anybody who hears that part and turns off the podcast, the radio show. So,
okay.
A lot of people don't really understand how taxes work, and Becky is definitely the expert here, but I definitely feel confident in being able to explain the basics here. So if anybody's ever done their taxes by hand, because what most people are hearing about, in news and things like that are deductions. With tax reform, the standard deduction almost doubled for most people, although the exemptions were eliminated, and we can talk about that a little further on. But those are things that reduced the adjusted gross income to get to your taxable income. And the taxable income, for anybody that's ever done their taxes by hand or ever watched someone do their taxes by hand, which is someone who paid attention to taxes probably more than 10 years ago as everybody's using software, that number, the taxable income was taken to the tax tables and lined up with the filing status and brought back what people owe in federal income tax. And there's a couple things added to that, the alternative minimum tax, credit repayments, and there's two new things this year. I don't remember what they are, but Becky probably does. But that gets you to what you call your tax liability, which is what you owe in federal income tax before credits and before other taxes are added in. And that's what the adoption tax credit can reduce. In prior years, if anybody's looking at last year's tax return, that would have been line 47 on a 1040 or line 30 on a 1040A. This year, with tax reform, that will show up on line 11.
Okay, perfect. Becky, we got a question, and I'm going to just summarize it. The person is saying that they had heard that the tax credit is only useful if they have federal tax liability, which is true. Then they said, but we do not pay any federal taxes. And they implied that they actually got a refund every year, they said they actually got a refund every year, which tells me that that they may be confused as to what is being withheld for their taxes, and assuming that they don't have to pay anything because they're actually not writing a check, but they are paying because they're having money withheld. So can you address the distinction that I think is fairly common between people who have money withheld from their paycheck to cover their federal tax liability?
Absolutely, and that is one of the biggest misunderstandings. The difference between your tax liability and your withholding is generally what you get back as a refund or what you pay every year. So some people, I get a refund, I don't have to pay, so that means it doesn't work. Now, if someone, absolutely has zero tax liability, they still need to go ahead and take the credit so they can carry that forward, obviously because everyone's tax situation can change from year to year, especially this year with the Tax Reform Act. But just because someone gets a refund does not mean that they do not have tax liability. Because it is a non-refundable credit at this point, it will cover their tax liability, and what they do not use, they can carry it forward for up to 5 years. So it's very important that even if you do have zero tax liability, you still need to go ahead and take the credit and carry that forward. That's a lot easier than having to go back and amend. And like I said, with the Tax Reform Act, there's a lot of people whose tax situations are going to be different this year. When it's non-refundable and it just covers your tax liability, federal tax liability, there are some things that it does not cover. It does not cover self-employment tax. It does not cover first-time homebuyer payback. And it also does not cover pension distribution penalty. So if you take something out of your retirement and you're under 59 and a half, you have that 10% penalty. And since it's a non-refundable credit and it just covers the tax liability, those three things will not be covered. So it's very important to see what your tax liability is. That's what I advise everyone. Look at your last year's tax return, and that will give you an idea of what your tax liability is each year, and that will kind of tell you how much you're going to be able to use of the adoption tax credit.
So another question that came in, and again, I'm going to summarize to make it quicker. If you can apply the adoption tax credit, and you've already you've already had the amount that you pay in taxes withheld out of your every paycheck, does that mean you will be getting a larger refund check from the IRS? Becky, let me ask that to you.
Yes, absolutely. Because what happens is when the adoption tax credit comes in and covers that tax liability, you are going to get your withholding back, plus you are going to get additional child tax credit, which this year is the refundable portion is $1,400 per child. That's the refundable portion. The actual child tax credit is $2,000, but the refundable portion is $1,400. So if the adoption tax credit takes care of your federal tax liability, and you don't have any self-employment tax or any of those other little odd things that's not covered by it, you should get all of your withholding back plus the additional child tax credit of $1,400 per child, as long as they qualify as your dependent for that year.
Well,
and how does? Oh, go ahead, Josh.
And the one other thing with that, though, is because I've run into this a couple of times with people who are retired and getting pensions, is for that additional child tax credit, there is an earned income requirement.
Correct. Yes, there is.
Yeah. So it won't hit everybody. It should hit most people, but it won't hit everybody.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Josh, what types of adoption are covered through the adoption tax credit?
International, private domestic or domestic infant, and foster care adoptions. The first two, the international and private domestic, typically it's based on the expenses that are paid for the adoption. For adoptions from foster care, usually families don't have expenses, or if they do, there's not very much. But if the children qualify for adoption assistance, they will qualify as special needs and can claim the full amount of the credit. Regardless of expenses actually paid. And the only adoption type that is not eligible is for adopting your spouse. So if you're doing a step-parent adoption, adopting the person that the child of the person you're married to, those expenses are not eligible.
And let me just throw in that even though embryo donation, creating your family through embryo donation, which is sometimes called embryo adoption, Becky, I'm fairly certain that that is not covered either. That's actually not really a form of adoption, but it is so often lumped in that I want to raise that. So the expenses associated with embryo donation, or sometimes called embryo adoption, are not covered either.
Correct.
Okay. Hey, Becky, what about same-sex partner second-parent adoptions where that's legal in a state?
If they are legally married, as Josh said earlier, it would be the spouse's child, and so therefore it would not qualify if they are legally married.
What if they're not legally married because if they're not either they are choosing not to?
Correct.
But
if they are
partners.
not legally married, yes, they can adopt the child and take the adoption tax credit.
And the one other thing I would say, just because the IRS often isn't good at nuance with the vast volumes of returns that they get, I have talked to some families who are trying to maximize their tax benefit, and if they aren't married, they plan to adopt their partner's child, and plan to get married and plan to adopt, but they aren't yet. If they want to maximize the benefit, they could adopt, but I would get married the next year.
Correct.
Okay, that was what I was going to say. Does it matter if, and this would apply to, I would assume, it would apply to same-sex partners as well as opposite-sex partners, and if they're not married by choice, not with same-sex partners, it may be by law, but assuming it's by choice, does that matter, Josh? Does it matter that they say, we're actually doing this for the tax benefit, so because it's better for us? Does that matter? Do they have that choice, and then for then being able to a second parent adoption, getting that covered?
Yeah, they definitely can do that. the IRS is, like I said, is doing vast quantities, and it's really what is the situation at the time of adoption. It's just like the other one that created problems for families is we have wonderful families who are adopting teenagers, and adopt kids before they turn 18, but turn 18 during the same year, the same tax year, and that can confuse the IRS, even though the child was legally eligible at the time. And that's why I just made the suggestion, if they do plan to get married at a late, at some point in time, and they want to maximize it, do it in another year just to prevent that extra work in
or the potential confusion.
Right. It clears the water.
Yeah. And will save you time in the end. So, Josh, if the child, let's take your example of the child turning 18. If at the time the adoption was finalized, the child was 17, then the parents are eligible for the adoption tax credit. Is that correct?
The child, yes, they'd be able to take it.
Even if the child 2 weeks later turns 18, and at the time you're filing your taxes, it's okay.
It's
gotcha.
18. Yep. And that may be, I would just say, anybody in that situation prepared to have the IRS ask about that. And if push comes to shove, I'm more than happy to talk with families. But they're going to have to provide documentation of the child, the adoption took place while the child was under 18.
Yeah, just documentation would indicate the date of the adoption as well as the child's birth date. And you would have to submit it. So what about if you complete 2 separate adoptions in 1 year, either adopting siblings or just 2 non-related children? Becky, how does that work with the adoption tax credit?
You would qualify for 2 of the adoption tax credit because it is per child, and I mean it depends on of course what type of adoption. If it's foster, if it's international, or if it's domestic. But let's just say, just for the sake of 2 adoptions, if they were final in that year, yes, you would qualify for the adoption tax credit for each child.
Okay.
And the one other thing I want to add, since we went to the sibling part, because there are tax preparers out there that don't read the instructions, like Becky I know does. If a family adopts 4 or more children in a year, they fill out additional Form 8839s. There's only spots for 3 children on one form. The instructions are very clear on this, but they would fill out an additional form to capture that 4th and 5th or 6th, and then even a 3rd form if there's a sibling group of 7.
Also, to tag that, if they carry it, if they have adoption tax credit to carry forward, they still need to do the additional 8839s as long as they're carrying that credit forward if they're doing more than 3.
And you can get all of these forms on the IRS website, and they are
correct.
And they're also linked in the instructions, so you can pop over there, and so it's easy to get. All right. Now, we say that the adoption tax credit is for qualified adoption expenses, and we'll talk about exceptions to that in a minute. But so let's talk about what a qualified adoption expense is for purposes of the adoption tax credit. Josh, you want to start off by hitting at the high points on what is included, and then we'll talk about some of the subtler distinctions in a minute.
Okay. Well, I'll go with the easy ones then. As listed in the instructions, adoption fees, attorney fees, court costs, travel expenses, including meals and lodging while away from the home, and readoption expenses relating to the adoption of a foreign child. This would also include background check, home study costs, all those things that normally people think of that they need to do to complete the adoption.
And a question we received that I will go ahead and answer, and that is if you pay a separate fee to a placing adoption agency and to a home study agency, both fees would be allowed to be included. Becky, what about things if facilitators or consultants are allowed in your state? I guess consultants are allowed in most, but if facilitators are allowed, can you claim the fees for adoption facilitators or consultants?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so if you need it to adopt, then it's generally covered. Okay,
correct.
Then let's talk about some things that perhaps often many states allow parents who are adopting an infant privately, a domestic infant adoption, to pay expenses of the expectant mom, both before and sometimes after, up to usually a specified amount of time after the birth. And they're usually legitimate expenses, and they're usually specified by state law what can be included. Things such as transportation and housing and food, things such as that, maternity clothes. Can those expenses, they're expectant mother expenses, but sometimes people are calling them birth mother expenses, so your agency might, can those be used to as part of your qualified adoption expenses under the adoption tax credit?
Birth mother expenses are not a qualified expense, unfortunately. There's very few things that are not qualified expenses, but unfortunately that is one of them, because the IRS, says all costs, directly relating to the adoption that are reasonable and necessary for your adoption, and unfortunately they don't, consider living expenses and things like that for the birth mother as a necessary expense.
Okay, well, let's also talk about failed domestic adoptions, or international, but let me start with failed domestic adoptions, either domestic infant adoptions or foster care, although usually there's not too many expenses there. So let's primarily focus on domestic infants. So you have applied, and perhaps you have been matched with an expectant mom. You are going forward. You have incurred expenses. Perhaps you're traveling to meet that person. Perhaps you've paid an agency fee. So you've incurred expenses. And then the mom decides to parent, so the adoption fails. What happens to those expenses that the adoptive family has incurred?
A couple of things. You have a couple of options. Option number one would be to, when you have a successful adoption after a failed adoption, is to combine those expenses and to claim it as one adoption. The other option that you have, option number two, is the year following after the expenses were paid. You have to wait a year. But after those expenses were paid, you can claim the adoption tax credit on your tax return the year following that the expenses were paid. But whatever credit that you receive for that failed adoption, when you file it, when you have a successful one, the amount of the credit that you receive for the failed adoption must come off the successful one. So let's say, for an example, you paid expenses in 2017 and the adoption failed. You could not take them on your 2017 return, but you could take them on your 2018 return, which you will be filing here shortly. And then since you do not have a Social Security number to tag on that Form 8839, I would suggest, number one, that in the name box, you just put not final, and then your return will have to go paper instead of electronic, and then attach a statement from your agency showing exactly what was paid and when it was paid, and that it was paid in 17. That way you qualify for it on the 18. A lot of people, they just choose to combine them because it, takes longer, whenever you file your tax return paper instead of electronically. But I do both. It's really up to the family what they would prefer. That is strictly for domestic. That is not for international.
We're going to talk about international in just a minute. So just to be clear, let's say, okay, let's use your example of you paid an agency fee and some travel costs that in the summer of 2017. In the fall of 2017, the baby is born and the mom decides to parent. And let's say that you decide that adoption is not for you. After that experience, you're saying, no, I'm not going to do it. So you have no intent of adopting again in the future. You can still apply for the adoption tax credit. You had to wait a year, so you'd be applying for it in the year 2018. You could still apply even though you do not ever plan on, at least at this point, adopting again. Is that, did I hear you correctly, Becky? Okay.
Correct. Yes.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Now, let's talk, Josh, about failed international adoption expenses. Let's say let's go back and using the example, you are attempting to adopt internationally, let's say China, and let's say you travel to China in the summer of 2017 to adopt a child, but when you get there, for whatever reason, you decide against finalizing that adoption, so the adoption does not go through, and you return home. Can you claim at any point the expenses that you incurred, your agency fee, your travel, or whatever, for the failed domestic adoption? International adoption.
No. For international adoptions, to be able to get the credit, it has to be final. And it was pretty heartbreaking when Russia closed and families were tens of thousands of dollars in that process and weren't able to recoup any of that with the adoption tax credit.
Okay. All right. So those are the primary distinctions, and we're going to go further to even more distinctions between domestic and international. All right, that's a great segue into the when can you claim the adoption tax credit? All right, let's start, Josh, let's start with you. We got a question from Jason. He says, if we have adoption expenses during 2018 but do not finalize an adoption in that year, and he's talking about a domestic infant, can I claim those expenses for my 2018 return, or do I have to wait until my 2019 return? So when can you claim the adoption tax credit for expenses incurred, let's say 2018 in this point, but the adoption, it's a domestic infant, and the adoption is not yet finalized?
As Becky had just said earlier, it would have to wait till 2019, but even if they did not get matched or finalized in 2019, they would be able to claim all of their 2018 expenses on their 2019 for a non-finalized domestic infant adoption.
So you have to wait a year, and then you can, even if it's still not final, you can claim
Correct.
it.
So Jason for sure will be able to file next year for what he paid in 2018. If he does finalize in 2019, they'll claim the 2018 and 2019 expenses on their 2019 taxes.
Gotcha.
Correct.
They'll just combine the two. Okay.
Correct.
Now, okay, Becky, let's talk about international then. When can you claim the adoption tax credit for an international adoption, which quite frankly now is often more than 1 year, the process from beginning to end, so you're incurring expenses over multiple years. So go ahead.
Correct. On the international adoptions, they do have to be final before you can apply for the adoption tax credit, and you accumulate the expenses. Generally, it's like you said, it's generally over, maybe even 2 or 3 years. So you would accumulate all of those expenses together, and then whenever the adoption is final for the international adoption, that says, okay, let's say, for example, it was final in 2018, so you would claim the adoption tax credit on your 2018 return that you are getting ready to file. The only exception to that is if it is a non-Hague country and you readopt in your state, you can choose to take when it was final in the country or when you readopt. You generally have to make that distinction. And the reason that's pretty important is because some of the states that have an estate adoption tax credit, it follows the federal. So whichever you choose as final, that is the year that you would apply for the state adoption tax credit. So you kind of need to be thinking about that if your state has an adoption tax credit, that if you are going to readopt take the credit on the year that you do the readoption, and then you can take the state at that same time. That's really the only time that there is any decision to be made. But general international adoption is it has to be final.
And nowadays, in the vast majority of countries, the adoption is finalized in country, meaning when the adoption is finalized as the parents have traveled over to the country where the child is living and is born, and the adoption is finalized then. I'm trying to remember, Josh, I don't know if there are, and the actual visa is an IR4 visa that a child would come on, if the adoption is non-finalized. I believe there are a few countries still where the adoption is not finalized in country. Do you know off the top of your head, Josh, if that is true?
I don't know.
Okay, I think there still are. And if that's the case, generally what happens is families then adopt the child. There's a final adoption here in the United States. Usually they have to wait whatever the required period of time is by that state, usually something around 6 months. So, Becky, in that case, it would follow into exactly what you just said, that you would then have to finalize here in the U.S. following your state law, which usually requires an X period of time that the child lives with you, 6 months or thereabouts. And then you finalize, and it's that date, because it's the adoption tax credit specifies that for international adoption, it is the date that you can claim. You have to go by the date the adoption is finalized. And I believe there are probably still a couple of countries that, although at this point they're not that many, and I'm not even 100% sure if there are any. Okay, excellent. Let me remind everyone that you are listening to Creating a Family, and we are talking today about the adoption tax credit with Josh Kroll and Becky Wilmoth. This show and all the resources we provide are supported by partners who believe in our mission. One such partner is Vista Del Mar. They are a licensed nonprofit adoption agency with over 65 years of experience helping to create families. They offer home study-only services as well as full-service infant adoption, international, and foster-to-adopt programs. All right, coming back to understanding more about the adoption tax credit. We've talked some about what are qualified expenses, and let me just say, oftentimes, particularly when we're speaking of domestic infant and international, I think people get hung up on what's qualified and what's not, but both of these types of adoptions usually cost in excess, and often significantly in excess, of the amount that the adoption tax credit is set for this year, 2018, $13,810. So we often tell people, when in doubt, just go with the. I mean, you're going to likely have a lot of expenses that are going to qualify. So don't sweat some of the ones that you're not 100% sure of. Just there are so many that are specified that are very clearly covered that you can just use those and not worry about the if you're not 100% sure of a specific one. All right, now I want to talk about special needs adoptions. Now, the adoption tax credit, the tax code is very clear on what is considered a special need for purposes of the adoption tax credit. Josh, what is a special need adoption to qualify, that would qualify for the adoption tax credit?
It basically comes down to, and they've gotten after some tax court cases where people challenged what is considered special needs, it basically comes down to does the child get adoption assistance from the state? Because the key language is that the state has determined the child wouldn't be adopted without adoption assistance. And so that determined in that tax court case was, is an action that needs to be taken. So if I'm adopting a private domestic child, an infant that has disabilities, but I don't get adoption assistance for that child, and maybe agency charges less because, the child has disabilities, I don't get the full amount. I have to have some form of adoption assistance from the state agency to qualify as special needs for the purpose of the adoption tax credit.
And where we see it coming up sometimes is, well, both of the description, what you just described, a child born with a handicap, and an agency has found a family. But we also see it come up in kinship adoptions, where the grandparents or aunts or uncles are adopting the child, but the child never entered the foster care system, and the child could have significant special needs, often very similar special needs as to children that we would see in foster care. But if the child never went through the foster care system and you as a family member adopt that child, regardless of the degree of special need the child has, they would not the family would not qualify for the adoption tax credit.
Just I know this will probably open up a little can of worms, but there are private adoptions, whether through an agency or independently through an attorney, that may be able to get adoption assistance if the child was found SSI eligible prior to being adopted, and then the family applied and received adoption assistance from the state before finalization. So that is a possibility, and we could talk about it on the other show we were talking about, scheduling in the near future. But it doesn't have to solely be from foster care, but that's the vast majority of these cases.
I suppose the thing to think about then is think about it in advance and raise it with your adoption agency or adoption attorney and probably your tax preparer, so that you can understand what it is you would need to do before the adoption is finalized and what we would need to apply for. So it's something to think about if you're adopting a child with a significant special need and not going through the state. And
Dawn, actually, I have one more point since we're talking about the special needs adoptions, because you may have some families in this situation. So when I talk about an adoption assistance agreement, the most common thing that people think about is the monthly payment that's called per diem, stipend, maintenance, basic, whatever, the monthly payment. But there are a number of states that have a category for children who are at high risk of having an issue, and they get a 0 monthly payment, but they provide either Medicaid through the adoption assistance agreement and or reimbursement of non-recurring adoption expenses. If a family has a $0 payment but has either Medicaid and or the reimbursement of non-recurring adoption expenses, even though I've never been able to get the IRS to put it in writing, they do accept that as special needs for the purpose of the IRS.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you a specific that you addressed part of what I was. When we say adoption assistance, there are different types of assistance that states may offer. I mean, the monthly payment is the one that we all think of, but you're right. Medicaid. Well, and what about college tuition? That's another assistance that's often offered. So if you as long as you've addressed Medicaid. What about your child is eligible for free college tuition? Would anything like that count as if you have it in writing, or even if you don't, I guess? Josh?
No, I mean what the IRS is really looking for, if they're not, it's not refundable, so they're not doing the widespread documentation, the audit correspondence audits like they did in 2010 and 11. But what they're really looking for, if they were to ask, is an adoption assistance agreement. And that's you're going to need to have a document that provides one of those specific three things. Like the states that have tuition waivers, those are on the code. I'm not seeing in the agreements language about that. And the states could take away that benefit before the child turns 18. So, I mean, I'm not trying to scare anybody because I don't think anybody's going to do that. Because Florida and Texas have been doing it for 20-some years, and they haven't taken it away. But the one state that probably is the most confusing on this, two states, I'll say, are the most confusing on this. Michigan has a medical subsidy program that is available to get benefits later on for children, even if they don't have the ongoing adoption subsidy or adoption assistance agreement, and that does not qualify. And in Georgia, they do a $0 agreement, but they do not provide the reimbursement nor the Medicaid, and that will not qualify. But most other states, I don't know of any other states where there's a real big problem. And because I deal with adoption subsidy, anybody that is unsure on this, I'm more than happy to talk to them directly.
Okay, excellent. All right.
Yeah.
Okay, so that is domestic infant. What about, we say now, we try to warn people now that the vast majority of international adoption, you should expect that the children coming home will have some form of special need. How is special needs adoptions handled, Becky, with international adoption under the adoption tax credit?
Well, Dawn, generally what you and I consider special needs and what the IRS considers special needs is two complete different things. Yeah. What the IRS considers special needs is basically hard to place. So for international adoptions, for IRS purposes, there is not a special needs designation. It is strictly for the expenses, whether the child, has any disabilities or anything like that going on. International is just for expenses. They don't have a special needs designation. And I'm thankful Josh mentioned on the subsidy agreement, there are subsidy agreements that don't come with money. And so I'm thankful that he mentioned that. And each state calls it something different, but it's actually just the subsidy agreement. But as far as international, there is no IRS designation for special needs for the adoption tax credit.
Okay. All right. Excellent. Well, not excellent necessarily. It's in fact just the
right.
opposite of excellent.
I understand what you're saying.
But most of those families are going to be, like you mentioned earlier about sweating the small things on expenses, most of those families are going to be over, $13,000-$14,000 in expenses for an international
Absolutely.
adoption. So it's not going to change the end result for them.
That's
Correct.
actually a really good point. Yeah. And so and yet people will feel like they are being, how can you tell me that my child who is in a wheelchair and blind is not special need? It's you've already
it's the law.
It's
the law. I mean, they have to be a U.S. citizen. So
the child may be a U.S. citizen. Hopefully will be a U.S. citizen upon final arrival back in the U.S. But nonetheless, you're going to have spent, if you're adopting internationally, you're going to have spent over $13,810. So it's a moot point because you will have qualified expenses. I can't imagine a scenario where I'm sure, no doubt, somebody is going to send us an email telling us of a scenario, but that would be the exception, not the rule.
The only scenario generally, Dawn, for international adoptions that they don't have over the maximum amount of the credit is if they have received substantial grants. And then if they have, for an example, they had $25,000 in qualified international adoption expenses and they received $15,000 in grants, that grant money has to come off the top, so they would only qualify for the $10,000. That's really the only time that ever comes into play.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point.
And that's actually, when you say grants, are you talking about an employer adoption assistance program, which is very confusing because we're using the same term? Okay.
No, she was talking about, we're going to come to that. I'm going to stop you now because we're going to have a whole section on that. No, as I understand it, there are. If I understood Becky's point, Becky, let me say what I thought you said to make sure we're right here. You were talking about grants, not employer adoption assistance, but grants from organizations that provide grants, particularly for significant special needs kids, or not even organizations. Sometimes agencies will have individuals that have provided a grant to help defray the cost of adopting a child with really significant special needs. Is that correct, Becky? Okay, good.
I'll have to double check because I think, and I can't right now because the IRS is on shutdown, but I've had shifting answers from the person who writes the instructions on can those still be taken as qualified adoption expenses if an outside source is helping fund it. And I'll have to double check on that and get back to you because that might still be open. Okay,
well then I tell you what we will do. We will, Josh will get back to us on that, and we will include that in the notes that are associated with this course and interview. So if it is, especially if it differs in some way. Okay, I had always heard what Becky had said, which was that it was not. But okay, we'll put a pin in that one, shall we say? Okay, Becky, what are the income exclusions? If you make, is the credit available regardless of your income, as long as you've got qualified adoption expenses, or is it, assuming you're not adopting from foster care with special needs, are there certain income exclusions?
For 2018, the income phase-out range for the adoption tax credit, it starts at $207,140, and the range goes to $247,140, and that's modified adjusted gross income. So once you are over that $247,140, you do not qualify for the adoption tax credit at all. And in between that phase-out range is kind of, it's kind of like chunks. Basically, as you get over that $207,140, you qualify for less and less as you get closer to the $247,140.
Okay, so there are some restrictions on income.
Correct.
All right. Let me pause for a moment to say that you are listening to Creating a Family, and we are talking about the adoption tax credit. And I have a favor to ask. Will you please write a review of this show? If you are of not just a specific show, although you're welcome to write a review of this specific show, but I meant in general for Creating a Family. We are the number one ranked show in this area of covering adoption and foster care, and I would really appreciate the way that we are ranked. That is because we have reviews, and it really means a lot. And particularly iTunes utilizes their reviews as the method for how they recommend shows to people, so it makes us more easily found. So anyway, it would mean a lot to me if you would pop over to iTunes, go to the Creating a Family show, and there's a button there, very easy. You can either do a star ranking, 1 to 5 stars, or and you can also write something specific, just that about the show that would help other people. So please, please, please pop over there. We really would appreciate it. All right. Now I want to come to I want to talk about the whole point of employee benefits. We raised that
Dawn?
a second ago. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I did find the email I had before. This isn't official ruling, but is the legal thoughts that we can't hold her to about like gifts and grants.
Okay, so let me go back and summarize what we're talking about.
Yeah.
If you have an international adoption, usually of a child with, I guess it doesn't have to be, significant special needs, but we often see that the grants will be coming for children with significant special needs. That may be a moot point, actually, for this discussion. Let's say regardless of special needs, you have an international adoption and you receive a grant from either the agency or from an independent granting organization to cover some of the cost or all of the cost for adopting that child. How does the adoption tax credit handle that grant money? Does it disqualify the grant money from qualified adoption expenses or not?
And this is, like I said, it is not an official private letter ruling or chief counsel advice, but basically crowdsourced contributions or grants would be treated as gift in how the money comes to the taxpayer, and that gift wouldn't necessarily change the qualification of the qualified adoption expenses. So like the example that is given, and I can share with you, although not widely, the email that I have, but the example is given. If I give you, Dawn, money to pay for your mortgage payment, even though I'm giving it to you, you will still be able to claim that as a deduction if you itemize your taxes next year. So my giving you that money doesn't disqualify your ability to get that tax benefit.
All right. And, Josh, will you give out right now your email? So if anyone is in the position and is wanting help with this specific issue, the best bet, this is not what Josh is saying, it appears to be I'm going to say a gray area because it's not official policy, but Josh will be able to provide this information to make it helpful for you. So, Josh, would you give out your email now?
It's JOSHK, so Josh K, at NACAC.org.
Okay, and that stands for the NACAC, NACAC stands for North American Council on Adoptable Children. Okay, perfect. Okay, so this is not official, so this is information that your tax provider, and you may have to make this case to the IRS, so Josh can help you by giving you the information that he has. All right, moving on to employee benefits. Becky, how are employer benefits? And let me just say that we are seeing more and more employers provide adoption benefits. Let's pause for a moment and say, yay!
Yes.
It's just terrific, and I truly, I'm just seeing a lot more of them doing that. So anyway, this is becoming certainly a more relevant topic. So how are employer benefits handled for purposes of the adoption tax credit?
Generally, your employer-provided adoption benefits that will show up in Box 12 of your W-2 with the code T, and your taxable amount of your salary can be reduced by that amount. Now, generally, depending on how much you have in expenses, if you have enough expenses, you may qualify for the income exclusion and apply for the credit. It just cannot be for the same expenses. So let's just say, for an example, you had $30,000 in qualified expenses. You have a qualified employer program. It has to be a written program, and the employee's given notice, and all those things. All those details are laid out in Publication 15B for the employee benefits provided by an employer. But you can qualify for the credit and for the full amount of the exclusion if you have enough expenses. Basically, you just can't double dip. But that income can be excluded, and it will just be on your W-2 with a code T, and that is how it is reported.
So if you have, Josh, I interrupted you. You were going to say something?
Go ahead. You summarize. I have a question I'll follow up with.
Okay, yeah, I was going to summarize. Okay. So basically there are potentially two types of tax benefits in the adoption tax credit code. One is the one we've been talking about up to this point, and that is the adoption tax credit, which can be used to reduce your taxable liability, whatever taxes you owe the federal government. That is applied to a one-on-one reduction to you owe X amount, and let's say you owe $13,000 in federal taxes, and you have qualified expenses that will directly offset what you owe for taxes. There's another type of tax benefit, and that is you can reduce your modified adjusted gross income? Is that the line? Is that the correct term, Becky?
Correct. What it does, it reduces the amount of taxable income that will show up in Box 1 of W-2. And the other benefit is you can also take the exclusion if you adopt from the foster care system, the child is considered special needs, and your employer has a qualified adoption program, you can also take the income exclusion. So,
okay.
I mean, it has multiple benefits here.
Even if you don't get that benefit.
What do you mean, even if you don't get that benefit?
Even if the employer doesn't actually pay the adoption assistance benefit to the family, they still can claim that full exclusion.
Correct.
Okay, so the adoption, so the employer has let's say, for example, a $10,000 adoption benefit. If you adopt from foster care, very often, in fact, most often, you would not be paying anywhere close to $10,000. In fact, you may well pay nothing. So your employer, depending on how the policy is written, but most of the policies I've read, they're not going to give you the $10,000. They're only going to allow you to. They'll only give you that if you actually pay. You have expenses. If you adopt from foster care, chances are good you would not. But if I'm hearing you correctly, Josh, that even if the employer does not give you any money to cover your adoption from foster care because you didn't pay anything, you can still reduce your taxable income on your taxes by the amount they would have paid you if you had expenses. Did I say that correctly, Josh?
Correct, except the amount would be the full $13,810.
Yeah. Well, okay, yeah.
And they do have to be considered special needs.
You would get to reduce your income by $13,000, even though the benefit, the employee benefit, was only $10,000.
Correct.
Okay. All right.
But they have to be considered special needs.
And there has to be a qualified adoption program prior to the adoption being final.
Meaning a qualified adoption program through employee benefit qualified adoption program. Is that what you meant?
Yes, ma'am.
Gotcha. Okay, gotcha. Now, the part about double dipping, let me make sure I've understood that correctly. I'm going to, so let's say you are doing an adoption, and it costs $30,000, and you have qualified adoption expenses of $13,810. So you offset that amount, and you use that as a credit. You have an employer benefit of $10,000. You have to make certain that the qualified adoption expenses that you are utilizing to justify the employee benefit are a separate set of expenses than the ones you used for the credit. I feel like I may have confused it more. But first, let me make sure that I'm correct. Becky, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
It might be easier if you say you have an adoption that costs $20,000. Your employer reimburses you $10,000, and you pay $20,000 for it. So you're going to exclude $10,000 of it, and instead of taking a credit of $13,810, you only have $10,000 left in qualified adoption expenses. So that's what you'll take the credit for.
Yeah, that may be more.
Yeah,
you're right.
That
does make it easier. In my head, my example made sense.
It's totally accurate. It just to make the point more clearly, you want to go under the total amount available.
Right. Well, and to make it really clear, if you use your agency fee of $8,000 for your benefits, you can't then submit the payment for the agency fee to the IRS to justify the credit. You have to choose some other expenses, which, again, depending on how much you spend, may or may not be a problem. Okay.
And also, one thing that Josh said earlier, I want to backtrack just a little bit. If it is a gift from someone, it absolutely does not go against their qualified expenses. If it's a gift from someone, it does not have to come off the top of their expenses. I just wanted to reiterate and affirm that is correct.
That's the point Josh was making earlier.
About grants and crowdfunding part,
Or gifts, just flat out gifts.
Yeah.
Your parents give you $10,000 to help you with providing them for a grand job. All right. Now let's go to the nuts and bolts here. What type of documentation should you submit with your taxes in order to simplify and reduce any chances of the IRS balking and taking longer and having you then not get your refund or get the credit when you think you want to? Becky, let's start with you, and then we'll let Josh chime in. So, Josh, be taking note if we miss anything.
Correct. Right now, you do not have to send anything in especially if you electronically file your return. All of the information will be on that form 8839. You no longer have to send, unless the IRS sends you back a letter requesting more documentation. Don't panic. The only thing, if the IRS does request more documentation, for all adoptions, they're going to want the final judgment of adoption that's signed and dated. And then also for foster care special needs adoption, they will want a copy of the adoption assistance determination, which is basically the subsidy agreement. That's for foster. They'll want the final judgment of adoption and a copy of the subsidy agreement, and those all, of course, have to be signed and dated. Now, for domestic and for international, they will want the final judgment of adoption, copy of the home study placement agreement, and a copy of all of the qualified expenses. And like I said, those all have to be signed and dated. The IRS will not accept it unless it's signed and dated. But as of right now, you do not have to send anything in when you file for the adoption tax credit. The only recommendation that I have, particularly, two things is, number one, if you are filing for the credit for a failed adoption, I would include a copy of the paid expenses when you send it in paper, but it's not completely necessary. But I recommend that you do, because there is no Social Security number to tag to that adoption tax credit. The other recommendation that I have is sometimes international receipts fade quickly. So when you get home, I would make a copy of all of your international receipts. If you don't have a good copier, go to some copy place and just make sure you have good copies. And then mark an IRS envelope and just put all of this stuff in there. And that way, if the IRS ever does request more documentation, just make a good copy. Don't ever send the originals. And then put whoever is primary on the tax return, put your Social Security number at the top of every page that you are sending to the IRS, and send it registered receipt. And
so what you don't submit it with, obviously at this point, particularly because you're filing electronically, but you need to have in your records and be prepared to be asked to provide that. And you need to have it in your records. And how long should you keep these records, Becky?
I recommend 7 years.
Okay, so you keep these records because the IRS, if they were to come back in the future, you obviously don't want to have to recreate this. And you want to have a copy of the adoption decree. Let me just confirm that if you're adopting internationally and your finalized adoption decree is a decree in this foreign country, that is sufficient.
Correct.
But it needs to be translated into English.
Correct.
Yeah.
So, and that comes down to the whole issue of that's a whole separate thing, but that's one reason some people go ahead and do finalize it and do a second adoption here in the U.S. just so that they have one that's in English for other purposes. But that's another thing. So you would need to have it translated, and it would have to be signed. And Becky's point is well taken that you also need to be concerned about the fading because you're going to keep it for a long period of time.
The other thing I would just say with the documenting expenses based on, it's better to hear this now because it's easier, as Becky was pointing out, to be proactive than reactive and try and recreate something, is when the IRS was doing the vast numbers of correspondence audits and asking for expenses, they wanted not only receipts but proof of payment. Because, I could just send you an invoice saying that I charged you $10,000, and they wanted proof that it was actually paid. So I would keep credit card or bank receipts that show payment. Just if you want to be really proactive and diligent and OCD on this, I would keep those also with those records.
Correct, absolutely. Because the IRS doesn't care what's been billed. They want to know what's been paid.
Well, that makes good sense. Okay, so in with your record, you're also going to be keeping not only you want proof that you paid it, whatever that is. Gotcha. All right, let's talk about it's been alluded to a couple of times that when you're filing your credit and your taxes, and you may or may not have a Social Security number or a adoption taxpayer identification number for the child. So what are, Becky, let's send this to you. What are some of the cases where you might not have these numbers, and what in the world do you do since there's a box that you have to fill out and put that information in, and if you don't have it, then what do you do?
One of your options for a domestic adoption, a lot of times you won't get that Social Security card until it's final, but yet they qualify as your dependent because they've been in your home since birth. So what you can do is file a W-7 with your tax return. It will take a little longer for everything, but that's what I recommend is file a W-7 with your tax return, and that is the application for the A-10. And then when everything is final, make sure and go back and apply for the Social Security card and Social Security number because they do expire. I've had several situations where, clients didn't realize that, that number would expire. And if they qualify for a Social Security number, they will not give them an A-10.
Okay, so an A-10 is what you get if you, for whatever reason, do not have the Social Security number of the child.
Correct.
Okay, got it. So that's how you would handle that. In the time we have left, I just want to make certain we touch on kinship adoptions in any way that can differ. So, Josh, we certainly see a lot of family who either have full guardianship or have completed adoptions for their children. They're not infants, or they might be infants. So is there anything different that we need to worry about for kinship providers who are caring for or adopting children, and how that might qualify, how that might impact the adoption tax credit?
So we have another hour? No, just kidding. I mean, there's so many things involved. In terms of the adoption tax credit, if they have a child that has significant disabilities, I would pursue the route to see if that child can get SSI and then apply for adoption assistance in the state where they reside if this is informal kinship with a child not in the foster care system. If that isn't a possibility, they, like anybody else who's doing any adoption, like a total stranger, not adopting their spouse's child, can claim the credit for expenses that they paid out of pocket. The one other thing that I would really caution any kinship, and there's lots of really great and valid reasons for them to move from guardianship to adoption, is are they currently accessing resources that they really need that may disappear if they adopt?
Very good point. Let me go back, though, and circle back. So for kinship providers who have guardianship, or it could be called different things. They can have permanent custody, guardianship, whatever it is called, but they have not gone through a formal adoption. Are they eligible for? They're raising the child, so they've got all the expenses, but there's no adoption. Can they qualify in any way, Josh?
Yep, but they can qualify for the expenses that they paid if the child does not get qualified as special needs by the state.
Well, that's if they adopt, though. If they don't adopt,
if they adopt, yeah. Oh, sorry. I thought we're talking. Sorry, I apologize. I didn't get that you were talking about if there was a guardianship credit, and there is not.
No, there's nothing. Okay.
Now,
does it matter how long? We have a question from someone who has been raising, I think it's her niece, for quite a few years. She doesn't say what the current legal arrangement is. She's wondering if she adopts the child now, can she still claim the adoption credit, even though the child has been living with her for quite a few years? Becky, I'll ask that one to you.
Well, it would be for the expenses only, related directly to the adoption. But, yes, she could.
Okay.
And assuming the kid's under 18, too.
Correct.
Oh, that's a good point. She doesn't. I think in this case the child is, but you're right. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, most likely, but, just want to throw that out there.
Well, it's true because we certainly see teens being, and we not unusually actually in our support group. People will adopt children who, just because it's important to the child, not that they, that the child wants to have a permanent family, and even though the child may be over 18. All right, so that's relevant. All right, well, thank you so much, Josh Kroll and Becky Wilmoth, for talking with us again today on the adoption tax credit. Let me remind people that you've been listening to Creating a Family, and we exist because of the support of our partners, and these are organizations who believe in education and support. And one such organization is Adoptions from the Heart. They have helped build over 6,000 families since 1985 through domestic infant adoption. To get more information, Josh, how would people reach you? You've already given your address, your email address, but can you give them the NACAC website for how they might reach you?
It's www.nacac.org, and my phone number is 651-644-3036, extension 15.
Okay, and Becky, for people who, first of all, it is such that you do not have to work with a tax preparer that lives in your state. Is that correct?
That is correct. We are enrolled agents, and we have the highest license that you can obtain from the IRS. And so I do taxes for all 50 states and represent clients for all 50 states.
So how would people reach you? Can you give your website and or email address?
Absolutely. Our website is billstaxservice.com, and there is an adoption tab on there. You can go in and our information, and there's several different articles that I have been asked to write for different adoption magazines. It's kind of a nuts and bolts on how the adoption tax credit works. And my email is Becky, BECKY, at Bills, BILLSTAX, 2.com.
Excellent. Thank you so much, and we will see you next week.
Let's say you just bought a house. Bad news is, you're one step closer to becoming your parents. You'll proudly mow the lawn, ask if anybody noticed you mowed the lawn, tell people to stay off the lawn, compare it to your neighbor's lawn, and complain about having to mow the lawn again. Good news is, it's easy to bundle home and auto through Progressive and save on your car insurance, which, of course, will go right into the lawn. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company, affiliates, and other insurers. Discount not available in all states or situations.